800 million people depend on a root that contains enough cyanide to kill an adult with just 7 ounces improperly processed. No government has ever banned it. It produces more calories per acre than any other major crop on the planet. And the ancestral knowledge to process it has kept entire civilizations alive for 10,000 years. This is the story of the world's most dangerous staple food and the communities that chose to cultivate poison because the alternative was starving to death. Welcome to Forgotten Soil Wisdom. It all began in the southwestern Amazon basin, specifically in the Mato Grosso and Rondônia regions of western Brazil. Approximately 10,000 years ago, around 8,000 years before Christ, indigenous peoples domesticated a root that would transform the history of human food. And genetic studies confirm that the wild plant Manihot esculenta subspecies flabellifolia became the ancestral progenitor of what we know today as cassava, manioc, or yucca. By the time Europeans arrived in 1492, the Taino communities of the Caribbean had perfected processing techniques that seemed like magic. The English word cassava derives from the Taino word kasabi. These peoples did not just cultivate cassava. They had cracked the code to transform a deadly poison into the sustenance of entire nations. The numbers explain why this root conquered continents. 7,800,000 calories per acre per year. That is what cassava produces. Potatoes reach 6,300,000. Rice barely reaches 2,400,000. And wheat produces approximately 1,600,000. No other major crop comes close to this caloric efficiency. 3.5 ounces of raw cassava contain 160 calories, almost double that of potatoes and more than rice. Global production reached 367 million tons in 2023, an increase of 32% since 2010. Nigeria leads with nearly 69 million tons, followed by the Democratic Republic of the Congo with 53 million tons. And the global market is valued between $87 billion and $198 billion, while Thailand dominates exports with more than $3 billion annually. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. There are 2 types of cassava. The sweet variety contains less than 0.8 ounces of cyanide per every 2.2 pounds, which makes it safe after simple cooking. The bitter variety, the one that feeds hundreds of millions of people, contains between 1.6 and 24.8 ounces of cyanide per every 2.2 pounds, up to 50 times more poison than its sweet cousin. And here is the paradox that defies all modern logic. The communities that depend most on cassava deliberately choose to cultivate the poisonous variety. The Tucanoan peoples of the Colombian Amazon cultivate 98 varieties of bitter cassava against only 2 sweet varieties. This ratio is not accidental, nor is it ignorance. It is calculated survival, ancestral knowledge perfected over millennia. Bitter cassava produces significantly more per acre and can remain in the ground for up to 36 months without being harvested, functioning as an underground food bank. Its toxic compounds, called cyanogenic glycosides, naturally repel pests and insects. And here is what matters most in regions of conflict and scarcity. Thieves cannot steal what they cannot eat without dying. In war zones and famine-prone regions, these characteristics mark the difference between living and dying. Bitter cassava is not just a food, it is a life insurance policy that grows underground. That insurance comes with a price that only ancestral knowledge can pay. Both varieties contain 2 compounds called cyanogenic glycosides. Linamarin represents between 93 and 97% of the toxic content, while lotaustralin represents the rest. When the plant cells break, whether by chewing, grating, or crushing, an enzyme called linamarin converts these compounds into hydrogen cyanide. The difference between varieties lies in the distribution. In sweet cassava, the toxins concentrate in the peel. In bitter cassava, the cyanide distributes evenly throughout the entire tuber. The human body can detoxify approximately 0.7 ounces of cyanide per day. Symptoms begin when 1 ounce daily is exceeded, and the lethal oral dose varies between 0.02 and 0.12 ounces per every 2.2 pounds of body weight. An adult weighing 132 pounds could die from consuming between 1 and 7.4 ounces of cyanide, and that amount is reached by eating between 7 and 14 ounces of raw bitter cassava. Less than 1 pound can kill. And this is where ancestral wisdom reveals its genius. Over millennia, communities that depend on cassava developed processing methods that eliminate between 96 and 99% of the cyanide content. This knowledge was not written in books. It was passed down from generation to generation, from mother to daughter, from elder to young. The African method of making flour involves crushing the cassava and drying it in the sun for more than 3 weeks, successfully eliminating between 96 and 99% of the cyanide. The production of gari, a staple food in West Africa, combines soaking, fermentation, and toasting over 2 to 4 days to achieve 98% elimination. Boiling cassava starting from cold water eliminates 92% of the cyanide in 30 minutes. The variable that determines everything is time. Soaking cassava for less than 4 hours provides insignificant protection. At least 18 to 24 hours of soaking are needed to achieve approximately 50% reduction. And each subsequent step, fermentation, pressing, drying, multiplies the detoxification effect. This knowledge saved millions of lives. When it is lost, the consequences are devastating. In 1938, Dr. Giovanni Trulli documented a mysterious paralysis in the Belgian Congo. The local Yaka communities called it konzo, which means tied legs, describing the sudden and permanent spastic paralysis that primarily attacked children and breastfeeding women. Trulli compiled more than 1,000 cases, some dating back 30 or 40 years. Today, scientists estimate that hundreds of thousands of people live with konzo. More than 100,000 cases in the Democratic Republic of the Congo alone. Konzo does not kill immediately like acute poisoning. It results from chronic exposure to cyanide, combined with protein-deficient diets that deprive the body of the sulfur amino acids needed for detoxification. Victims experience a sudden onset of irreversible leg paralysis. The damage occurs within hours. It persists for life. In the most severely affected areas of the Kahemba district, up to 20% of the population shows konzo symptoms. The 2009 epidemic recorded 2,046 confirmed cases. Nearly 2,000 children were paralyzed during a single dry season when water scarcity prevented proper soaking. Fatal poisonings continue to this day. On March 9, 2005, at San Jose Elementary School on the island of Bohol, Philippines, a vendor offered fried caramelized cassava to students during recess. Between 27 and 30 children died. More than 100 ended up hospitalized. The victims were between 7 and 13 years old. In September 2017, 98 cases and 2 deaths shook Uganda from flour made from wild bitter cultivars. The flour contained 88 parts per million of cyanide, nearly 9 times the safety limit of 10 parts per million established by the World Health Organization. May 2020 brought the death of 2 children in Vietnam, one 3 years old and another 10, after eating cassava sprouts. Between 2023 and 2024, multiple incidents in Namibian villages led the governor to declare an alarming rise in cassava deaths. These incidents share common patterns: droughts or economic crises that force shortcuts in processing, lack of access to water for proper soaking, or consumption of wild varieties with uncontrolled cyanide levels. When ancestral knowledge is interrupted, when conditions prevent following traditional steps, cassava claims lives. And there the inevitable question arises. With children dying, with hundreds of thousands of people paralyzed, With epidemics continuing to this day, no government has banned bitter cassava. The answer reveals an impossible mathematics that the world prefers not to discuss. 250 million Africans depend on cassava as their primary source of calories. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, cassava provides more than 1,000 calories per person per day. It is breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Banning bitter cassava would cause an immediate famine of magnitude, several orders greater than cumulative deaths from poisoning. The Codex Alimentarius, the joint food standards body of the FAO and the WHO, explicitly permits the trade of bitter cassava under standard CXS 300-2010. It only requires that products be labeled as bitter with proper preparation instructions. The international standard establishes 0.35 ounces of cyanide per every 2.2 pounds as the maximum for ready-to-eat products. It is a processing standard, not a prohibition. The history of how cassava spread around the world reveals both human genius and its tragedies. Portuguese colonizers recognized the value of cassava for provisioning slave ships on transatlantic crossings. In 1558, traders introduced the crop to the Congo Basin. By 1592, Brazilian Jesuits were trading cassava flour with missionaries in Luanda in exchange for enslaved Africans. The survival characteristics of the crop proved transformative during the era of violence. Unlike grain stores that raiders could confiscate, cassava remains underground until harvest. When communities fled slave raids, their cassava fields survived and provided food upon return. The poison that protected the root from pests also protected it from human plunder. Colonial administrations mandated cassava cultivation. The British Kenya Native Ordinance, in effect between the 1920s and 1940s, forced Africans to plant cassava during locust invasions and droughts. Portuguese colonial officials promoted it as provisions for slave trade ships and as famine insurance for colonial subjects. The Belgian Congo established cassava research programs, while Trolli documented the devastation of Konzo. By the colonial era, cassava had become the dominant staple food of Africa, spreading to the east of the continent by 1850 and reaching Asia through Portuguese outposts in Goa, Malacca, and Indonesia during the 16th century. A crop that began in the Amazon was already feeding 3 continents. The global regulatory pattern reveals a consistent choice: education over prohibition. Countries with severe Konzo epidemics have implemented processing training programs, have developed wetting method interventions that reduce cyanide levels to safe thresholds, and have promoted safer varieties through agricultural extension. None have banned the crop. Research institutions like the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture have developed cassava varieties with lower cyanogenic potential that maintain acceptable yields. Dr. Hans Rosling, the Swedish epidemiologist who established the link between Konzo and cassava cyanide in 1990, advocated for processing education instead of crop substitution. He recognized that telling impoverished communities to abandon their primary food source was neither realistic nor ethical. Bitter cassava embodies an uncomfortable truth about global food security. Sometimes the best available option carries significant risks, with climate change increasing the frequency of droughts in cassava-dependent regions, conditions that both raise the plant's cyanide levels and eliminate the water needed for safe processing. The tension between this crop's extraordinary productivity and its inherent toxicity will only intensify. This is not a story of governmental neglect, nor of failed prohibition. It is a story of communities making rational decisions under impossible constraints. When the alternative is starving to death, a route that requires careful processing beats no food at all. The absence of bans does not reflect regulatory failure, but rather recognition of this calculus, and perhaps an implicit acknowledgement that for hundreds of millions of people, bitter cassava remains what it has been for 10,000 years. The difference between surviving and not. Ancestral processing knowledge is not an anthropological curiosity. It is survival technology developed over millennia, refined by the experience of countless generations. Each traditional method, from prolonged soaking to controlled fermentation, represents the collective response of communities that learned, often at the cost of lost lives, how to transform poison into sustenance. Bitter cassava is not a villain in this story. It is a reminder that human survival rarely offers perfect choices, only choices less bad than the alternatives, and the knowledge to navigate that reality. The knowledge that turns poison into food is exactly the kind of wisdom that the modern world prefers to forget, while depending on increasingly fragile food systems. This wisdom is not lost. It is buried in the practices of communities that continue to process cassava as their ancestors did. It is in the hands of women who soak, ferment, and dry following rhythms that predate written history. It is in the knowledge that some plants demand respect, patience, and the exact fulfillment of steps that modern haste considers inconvenient. If this unearthed truth changed the way you see ancestral knowledge, subscribe to Forgotten Soil Wisdom and hit the bell. Every like and every share helps preserve wisdoms that the modern world tries to ignore.